Hi, welcome to Ethics. My name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we're going to be discussing Friedrich Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality. Let's go ahead and get started with just a couple of remarks about Friedrich Nietzsche and some of his key ideas, and then we'll actually take a look at some of the first essay in the Genealogy of Morality. So, welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope you've been following the series. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He lived from 1844 to 1900. He was actually born in Saxony, Prussia, to a Lutheran minister, but then eventually began studying philology at the University of Bonn in Leipzig, so actually classical studies, eventually graduating with a PhD in philology, which we'll see became his approach philosophically. And we'll talk a little bit here about philology and philosophy in a couple moments. He was influenced by the work of Schopenhauer, but we'll see that Schopenhauer's emphasis on the will is primarily sort of what Nietzsche seems to take from Schopenhauer, but we'll see that he reverses the priority of Schopenhauer's analysis. Nietzsche himself was appointed at a very young age, at the age of 24, as a professor of the Swiss University of Basel, and at which point I don't believe he had his doctorate yet. He unfortunately he didn't his career didn't last long, and he actually resigned from Basel in 1879. Not that much longer after he would only have about 10 more productive years philosophically after he resigned from the university in 1889, and then he lived the last 10 to 11 years of his life really in almost a catatonic state. Many scholars believe that he likely contracted syphilis. So, and then of course, Nietzsche dies in 1900, so right at the turn of the 20th century. So you can say that Nietzsche here is one of the last 19th century philosophers, or he's one of the first contemporary 20th/20th century philosophers. Um, and I would say this is his impact has principally been in probably the 20th century, obviously. So what I want to do now is let's move here to some of Nietzsche's key ideas and key works. So some of the key works you'll want to take a look at, particularly if you decide to do more research in Nietzsche's work, is his very first book, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, in which Nietzsche ultimately compares two sort of forms of life, two forms of tragedy we see, what he compares the Dionysian versus the Apollonian. So take a look at The Birth of Tragedy. It's one of his first works. It's an important work, but I think it was a misunderstood work when it was published in 1872. The other text to take a look at is All Too Human. In fact, we'll see that Nietzsche addresses and talks about that book directly right at the beginning in the preface of A Genealogy of Morality. He also has The Gay Science for 1882. Of course, The Genealogy of Morality, which we're looking at today, which was published in 1887, or I'm sorry, written in 1887. There's also The Twilight of the Idols from 1889, The Antichrist from 1895, Ecce Homo from 1908, and of course, I put it here at the end, but one of his most important works is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a very, very different work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's about a prophet named Zarathustra. And so it's essentially philosophy told through narrative. And we haven't really seen too much of this in contemporary philosophy, but we see it here with Nietzsche. So those are some of the key works. By no means is this everything that Nietzsche wrote, but this is a great list of works you should take a look at if you're interested in following up on your studies with Nietzsche here. Now, a couple key ideas. I want to take us through a couple of these. The first is the notion of a philosophy of existence. Nietzsche is known as an existentialist philosopher, or if you will, a philosopher of existence. And this is because ultimately Nietzsche is not interested in articulating these transcendental ideals of how things should be. Nietzsche always begins with his feet on the ground by looking at how we actually exist. And he's going to do the same thing with morality. So instead of doing an analysis of ethical theory the way we saw Kant giving an analysis, right, where Kant argues that something is good in and of itself and you have a duty to do it regardless of whether or not God tells you to do that duty, or whether or not fulfilling that duty would cause harm, etc., etc. For Kant, ethics is about sort of a theoretical purity. You couldn't see anything more different in the work of Nietzsche, where Nietzsche begins not with the question of what things should be, but by looking at what sort of morality we actually have and using the basis of our actual existing moral framework as a way to begin an analysis of morality. Now, one of the key ideas that Nietzsche is going to talk about here is the will to power. And in many ways, this is a psychological insight for Nietzsche. Nietzsche describes this notion of the will to power as being, if you will, the fundamental drive that drives us in our actions. And it's something it's inherent in all of us, and so it must be a psychological characteristic. In fact, in the early, I believe it was the early 1920s, psychoanalytic theorists, right, were questioning whether or not Freud had really stole some of his ideas from Nietzsche's notion of the will to power. So it's very interesting sort of backstory between psychology, psychoanalysis, and Nietzsche. There's an interesting set of common concerns. But what we can say here is that at least for Nietzsche, he has this notion that everyone has a natural instinct to empower their own will. And so to give you an example, all of us, each of us have things that we want, right? So for instance, you want an A in this class, right? Well, that's something that you will, but Nietzsche's notion is we don't just have an instinct to want things and then to will ourselves to get those things, but that what we ultimately we want our will empowered. So this is the notion of the will to power, sort of psychological concept. The other thing is, if we were to articulate Nietzsche's epistemology, recall that epistemology refers to your theory of knowledge. What we would say is that Nietzsche conforms to a perspectivism. Perspectivism is the notion that what is known is always known according to the perspective of the knower, right? So, for instance, we all know that if myself, and let's imagine all the people in our class or all the people you know, imagine there's a cohort of people and we all witness some sort of event. Maybe we witness a murder, for instance. If we witness a murder, notice that it's highly, highly likely that we may actually all remember things slightly differently. And the reason it seems that we remember things differently, besides the fact that we're different people, seems to be because we all occupy different perspectives within the world. And it looks like our perspectives can never be superimposed upon each other. So, in other words, you can never actually occupy my perspective, and I conversely can never occupy your perspective. Now, which perspective is valid? The answer here is they're both equally valid because we can't actually engage in knowledge beyond the perspectival conditions which enable us to actually perceive things as known. So, what this entails then is that for Nietzsche, we have a sort of perspectivism. And this ultimately is going to flirt with and ultimately, I think, invite the notion of nihilism. Nihilism is the view that something is meaningless, right? As something has no value. And you can ask yourself here, which is namely, if all we know about the world is simply given according to our own perspective, then it raises the question as to the value of the sorts of perspectives we hold. And we'll see Nietzsche has a more refined analysis about nihilism than this, but I want you to be thinking in the background here about the relationship between his epistemology of perspectivism, that is, his approach of knowledge being that it's always grounded in an individual subjective perception, and also thinking about how that relates to this problem of nihilism or meaninglessness. Okay, one of the key things in terms of time on the meaninglessness is Nietzsche's position that God is dead. Now, we have to be a bit careful here because Nietzsche doesn't simply think that God's dead because he doesn't think that God ever existed in the first place. So that means that this phrase God is dead is meant to actually be provocative, to provoke you into considering your own views. And Nietzsche's view here is that most of us have a certain sort of moral system that we believe and that we live according to. And that when we're asked why it is and what validates objectively our views about morality, most of us rely upon a conception of God. And ultimately, Nietzsche actually thinks historically that with the role of Christianity in the Roman Empire, what we see is that God becomes actually a functionally important element within the overall moral system. But if God is dead, if you're an atheist, for instance, then Nietzsche thinks that you probably haven't taken seriously the degree to which God not existing would have on your operational moral theory. That, in other words, what makes stealing wrong? If you think that what makes stealing wrong is that God commands that you shouldn't steal, then if there is no God, then that means you seem to lose the ability to have to hold on to the idea that stealing is wrong. Now, Nietzsche's point here isn't that this only applies to people who believe in God. Quite the contrary. Nietzsche's argument here is that he thinks that atheists, for instance, and secularists, they want to maintain a morally prescriptive order that runs in line with sort of the Christian and Western history of morality, but he thinks that the atheist doesn't want to recognize that if God is dead, all things are permitted. Or in other words, our moral values are not objectively determined; they're determined ultimately by how we exist and how we choose to will ourselves into power. So you have this notion that God is dead. I also want you to see here is that since Nietzsche is thinking about morality as being something which we need to look to morality first and foremost at the existing forms of morality. This entails, because human culture is in a state of evolution, that morality itself is also in a state of evolution. Now, if we're going to compare and contrast this, we've read Aristotle and we've read Kant. Both of those thinkers, Aristotle is a little bit more dynamic in the sense that he wants to make sure that his conception of balance is always situational to a given context that we're looking at. With Kant, we saw the idea that something is morally wrong or right in terms of its conceptual purity. And so you can see that's certainly not a notion that, right? Kant's view is that morality is static and never changes, because in other words, the categorical imperative never changes or never stops applying to one group or another. It always applies to all groups. That's why it's a categorical imperative. But that view of seeing morality for Kant is a static view. With Nietzsche, we see a dynamic view that morality is in a state of evolution, and that ultimately uh, the values we hold, the moral values we hold, are contingent upon that history. So we're going to see here that Nietzsche's analysis of morality, his theory of morality, if you will, involves quite strongly an analysis of history, the historicity of morality. There's also this other conception that Nietzsche is going to talk about and that we're going to see here. And this is the notion of the Übermensch, or the overman, sometimes translated as the Superman. And the notion of the Übermensch here is that these were people who would create, through the will to power, their own moral system. He, in fact, the example that Nietzsche gives here is of Napoleon, right? And we'll talk about that when we get there. But Napoleon seems to be one of these people who was not bounded by the conventional moral views of his own day or the people he surrounded himself with. Rather, it looks like Napoleon's values were rooted first and foremost in his own perspective and in his will to power. And Nietzsche ultimately argues that at the end of the day, morality is always open to an Übermensch coming in and retransforming everyone. And we're going to sort of see these key themes throughout our discussion of Nietzsche, not only in today's lecture, but in the next couple as well, as we sort of look to Nietzsche. Now, what I want to do now is I want to show you a short video clip here. It actually comes from YouTube, but it's actually from a film called The Turin Horrors. I'm going to show you just a real brief clip of it. But this movie is essentially a story about Nietzsche. And I wanted to start here because we're going to see that the director here has one of these characters who's meeting, I believe, who's meeting the main character in the film. And this bald gentleman you see before you, he essentially begins to articulate some of the same themes that we're going to see Nietzsche discuss in today's lecture. Let's take a look.
Elfogyott a pálinkám. Add egy üveggel. Adj neki. Miért nem a városba ment? Mert elfújta a szél. Hogy fújta volna el? Mert tönkrement. Hogy ment volna tönkre? Mert minden tönkre ment. Minden lealjasodott. De mondhatom magának azt is, hogy mindent tönkretettek. És mindent lealjasítottak. Mert itt nem valami istenítélet forog fenn, az úgynevezett ártatlan emberiség illettel. Éppen, hogy pont fordított a dolog. Az embernek a saját ítéletéről van szó. Mégpedig a saját ítéletéről. És pedig saját maga felett. Amiben persze a Jóisten rendesen benne van. Hogy azt nem mondjam, közreműködik. És amiben közreműködik, nos hát, a legordináriabb teremtés, amit maga csak el tud képzelni. Megrontották a földet, tudja? Hiába mondok magának bármit, mert mindent megrontottak, amit megszereztek. Márpedig egy aljas, sunyi, alattomos harcban mindent megszereztek. Mindent meg is rontottak. Amihez ezek hozzájutottak, azt megrontották. Márpedig mindenhez hozzájutottak. Így ment ez a teljes győzelemig, a teljes diadalmas végig. Megszerezni, megrontani, megrontani, megszerezni. De mondhatom magának másképp is, ha akarja. Vagy hozzáérni, megrontani és úgy szerezni meg. Vagy hozzáérni, megszerezni és így rontani meg. Ez ment. Évszázadokon át. Ment és ment. Csak ez ment. Néha suttyomban. Néha durván. Néha finoman. Néha brutálisan. Ment. Csak ment. De mindig csak egyféleképpen. Ahogy a patkány mar a lesből. Mert tudja, ehhez a tökéletes győzelemhez kellett az is, hogy az ellenfél, hogy mondja magának, tehát minden, ami kiváló, nagyszerű, valahol, nemes, érti? Ne bocsátkozzon eleve semmiféle harcba. Ne legyen semmiféle küzdelem. Csak az egyik félnek a hirtelen eltűnése. Márpedig a kiválóaknak, a nagyszerűeknek, a nemeseknek az eltűnése. Hogy már ezek a lesből marással győztesek uralják a földet. És nincs egy icike-picike odó sem, hova el lehetne előlük valamit dugni. Mert minden az övék, ami megszerezhető. Övék az is, amiről azt gondoljuk, hogy talán nem érik el. De elérik. Övék ma már az ég. Övék az összes álom. Övék a pillanat, a természet, a végtelen csend. Még a halhatatlanság is az övék, érti? Minden örökre elvezett. És az a sok nemes, kiváló és nagyszerű, csak állt, hogy így fejezzem ki magam, csak állt ezen a ponton. És meg kellett, hogy értse, és bele kellett, hogy törődjön. Egy. Se Isten, se Istenek. És ezek a kiválóak, nagyszerűek és a nemesek már rögtön az elején meg kellett, hogy értsék, és bele kellett, hogy törődjenek. Persze, képtelenek voltak erre. Egyszerűen nem értették a dolgot. Elhinni, elhitték, tudomásul venni, tudomásul vették. De nem értették. Csak álltak ott értetlenül, bele nem törődve. Tudja, még valami, az a vihar, az ész felől meg nem világosította őket. Akkor viszont már egy csapásra rájöttek, hogy se Isten, se Istenek. Akkor már egy csapásra fölfogták, hogy se jó, se rossz. Akkor már megértették és fölfogták. Ha mindez így van, akkor talán nincsenek már ők sem. Tudja, szerintem ez lehetett az a pillanat, amikor azt mondhatjuk, hogy kihúnytak, elhamvadtak. Kihúnytak és elhamvadtak, mint a tűz, ami csak úgy magára hagyott valaki a réten. Az egyik folyamatosan vesztett, a másik folyamatosan győzött. Veszteség, győzelem. Veszteség, győzelem. És nekem egy nap, itt a szomszédban, rá kellett arra jönnöm. Rá is jöttem. Tévedtem. Szomszéd, óriási tévedtem. Mikor arra gondoltam, hogy itt a földön valóban nem volt, és nem is lehetett semmiféle fordulat. Mert higgy el, én már tudom, ez a fordulat valóban bekövetkezett.
Hogyan már? Marhaság.
Okay, as you can see, that's a scene from it's called The Turin Horse, which is about Nietzsche, and of course, this recalls the famous story in which Nietzsche, right before he right before his sort of the end of his productive years, he actually walked down from his apartment and walked over to where a man was beating a horse, stopped the man from beating a horse, talked to the horse, started weeping, and then collapsed. And this movie is sort of about Nietzsche, but this character here, I think, introduces in the film very nicely, not to mention its very beautiful film cinematography, but this character introduces some of the key themes we're going to see Nietzsche discussing in the Genealogy of Morality. So I thought it'd be appropriate to sort of begin by sort of giving you a sense of what it feels like in Nietzsche's, give you a sense of a sort of feeling of what Nietzsche's philosophy and the Genealogy of Morality is all about. Okay, now let's move on here and take a look at the preface to Genealogy of Morality. So, the first sort of point here, and you're going to see what we're going to do in today's video is really focus on the preface to the Genealogy of Morality, and then we'll take a look at the first essay in the Genealogy of Morality. And I've sort of taken this point by point. You'll see that Nietzsche writes in what are known as aphorisms, or sometimes he writes in sort of short segments. And so what I've tried to do is try to have a little point, a slide here for each of the main points. So that way, as we walk through this, you should get a fairly robust understanding of the type of argument that Nietzsche is ultimately interested in here. Now, the preface to the Genealogy of Morality begins with this very provocative quote or discussion that we as philosophers, right, and think here of yourself as a philosopher, having explored the moral theories of Aristotle and Kant and other philosophers, that we as philosophers are interested in obtaining knowledge. And Nietzsche wants us to begin from the very beginning by recognizing that even though we thirst after knowledge, we are ourselves our own desert, or in other words, we are unknown to ourselves. Nietzsche writes, "So we are necessarily strangers to ourselves. We do not comprehend ourselves. We have to misunderstand ourselves. For us, the law that each is furthest from himself applies to all eternity. We're not men of knowledge with respect to ourselves." And here Nietzsche is engendering us to consider that we already live in the world with a whole series of moral values and that we never inquire about the moral values we hold, only the values that we think of theoretically through the transcendental philosophical lens, if you will. But when we actually try to understand where our own moral values come from, what Nietzsche seems to suggest here is that we're in as much of the dark as anyone else. Okay, now there's a couple key questions that'll get raised here. Number one here is, what is the origin of our moral prejudices? And here I want you to consider the sorts of moral views that you yourself hold. Call these moral prejudices if you like, but where do they come from? So for instance, we all have a sort of prejudice, like take for example adultery. Adultery is considered immoral, but why exactly? What's the origin, the historical origin, that might explain these sorts of moral beliefs that we hold? Now, Nietzsche here says that take a look at his book, All Too Human, a book for free spirits, in which he begins to first sort of explore the origin of morality. Though he doesn't, even though he discusses it in some of his early insights are discussed in All Too Human, it's this particular work, A Genealogy of Morality, that ultimately allows Nietzsche his full expression regarding the origin of our moral prejudices. Now, the other thing he mentions here in this second section is that the philosopher has a will to knowledge. This is very important. The philosopher is actually striving to gain and attain knowledge. And the fact that the philosopher has a will to do this is for Nietzsche a very important and crucial point. And this relates back to what we discussed earlier in terms of the will to power. So this means that even for Nietzsche, philosophy is not a purely valueless exercise, or put it this way, philosophy is not a purely neutral activity. It is one that is guided by the will, ultimately. And this is very important. So that means, in a certain way, what Nietzsche is asking us to do in this work is to gain a will towards the knowledge of our own moral practices and prejudices. Nietzsche writes, "Do our ideas, our values, our yeas and nays, our ifs and buts grow out of us with the necessity with which a tree bears fruit, related in each one with an infinity to each, and evidence of one will, one health, one sail, one sun." And so it looks like here Nietzsche's implying that the will is ultimately what cultivates the unity of our beliefs. It's not in the beliefs themselves, but it has to do with the existence of our own will and the activity of our will. Let's move forward here. Now, in terms of morality, there's a couple things that Nietzsche mentions. Number one is that morality is for Nietzsche a quote, a priori. Now, here we can distinguish the language here between the a priori versus the a posteriori. A priori means that which comes before, which is necessarily in view after you have experience of something. The a posteriori means that which comes after our experience or comes in lieu of our having experienced it. So, for instance, we could say that time and space are a priori, right? You never experience time and space. It's rather always according to time or temporal and spatial parameters that we have experience. So you don't experience space and time, but it's because of space and time's already sort of a priori condition that enables us to experience things. For Nietzsche, morality is an a priori in terms of his analysis, and he will talk about his sort of history and how he got into this subject. One of his earliest concerns here was where do good and evil originate from, right? Where does good come from? Where does evil come from? Now, the first solution to the origin of evil, according to Nietzsche, when his first writings on the topic, was that God was actually the source for the origin of evil. In other words, that God was evil, or maybe I should say is that God created evil, thereby implying that God was evil. That's a sort of what he says is a quote anti-Kantian, enigmatic categorical imperative, right? So you can see here that Nietzsche is also familiar with the Immanuel Kant that we've looked at, and he's familiar with the categorical imperative. So you can see here is that in many ways, Nietzsche is the yin to the Kantian yang, right? Yin and yang. They're sort of opposing views here of morality. But for Nietzsche, the problem of morality was always front and center. Some of the early lessons that Nietzsche says that he gathered from his his analysis of morality and his teachings and learnings was that number one, there's a separate moral and a separate theological prejudice. So that means that we have certain moral beliefs, we have certain theological beliefs and prejudices and perspectives, but that doesn't mean that they're the same. And that means that for Nietzsche, the theological is separate from the moral. But we will see, and we will discuss the notion that ultimately for Nietzsche, without a sort of transcendental guarantee, without a God, this does leave morality to the likes of our own perspectives. Number two, we could say that we have to stop looking for the origin of evil that's behind the world, as it were. In other words, what Nietzsche wants to do is, he says, for instance, originally his supposition was that God was the source of evil. This is not what Nietzsche thinks ultimately, right? Because what he realizes that if we want to understand the origin of evil, we have to stop looking behind the world to some sort of transcendental, and we need to look at the actual world. We need to look at the way existing forms of life actually give rise to our conceptions of good and our conceptions of evil. So ultimately, he doesn't hold to the idea that God is the responsible for evil, because ultimately, for him, God doesn't exist, which leaves us, which means that instead of looking behind the world or above the world or beyond the world, what we need to look for in terms of the origin of morality is we need to look to ourselves. And this means that we need to departmentalize the problem. And we need to start recognizing how this problem relates to the other sorts of prejudices or philosophical beliefs that we hold. Now, Nietzsche was in section 4 here, we see that Nietzsche was first spurred onto the hypothesis for a genealogy of morality when he read The Origin of Moral Sensations by Paul Rée. Now, The Origin of Moral Sensations, I'll be honest with you, I haven't read it, so Nietzsche's just telling us about it. But the origin of moral sensations is for Nietzsche the opposite of what his view. And he says, quote, "I've never read anything to which I would have said to myself, no, proposition by proposition, conclusion by conclusion, to the extent that I did to this book. So this is sort of interesting. It looks like what really gets Nietzsche thinking about this, the topic of the origin of morality, comes when he reads this book on the origin of moral sensations, and he realizes he disagrees with everything that's being written on the topic, at least by Paul Ray. And this sort of prompts him to begin to develop his own origin philosophy. Now, Nietzsche does take a little bit of time in this section to cross-reference some of the ideas he's working with here with what he does in All Too Human. So, for instance, he gives a couple examples in section 45 All Too Human. Nietzsche talks about the twofold history of good and evil. That's something that's become prominent in the first essay here. In section 136 of that work, he begins to talk about the value and the origin of moral asceticism. And he talks about the morality of mores in section 96, 99, and 89, etc., etc. So Nietzsche is not only aware of the sort of way in which his other previous works have talked about this, he actually tells us point by point. So if you decide to use Nietzsche for one of your research papers, then you'd probably want to take a look at Nietzsche's own sort of cross-referencing to his other texts, so you could build a fuller picture. Now, moving on here, what we can say, and then remember we're still in the preface here, is that the subject of this book is the value of morality. And here Nietzsche talks about the idea that Schopenhauer was a huge influence on him, but ultimately that his subject on the value of morality comes as an outgrowth of his critique of Schopenhauer, right? So for Schopenhauer, Schopenhauer was concerned with the value of the unegoistic, the non-egoistic. Remember, ethical egoism, is the notion that you should pursue what's in your own self-interest. And so the notion here is that there seems to be in morality a value to altruism, a value to the non-egoistic. And we're going to see here is that Nietzsche is going to disagree with that. Right? In fact, Nietzsche is going to argue that the value of morality is specifically rooted in the egoism of the noble class, right? But it is egoistic. Number two here secondly, is Nietzsche criticizes Schopenhauer's discussion of the instincts of pity, self-abnegation, and self-sacrifice. Notice here that having pity on others, and Nietzsche is very much against pity, and so are most of the other philosophers, but notice how in our ordinary moral discourse, we put a lot of emphasis on the person who has self-sacrifice, who's someone who does something that negates their own desires, they do things for the greater good, and so on and so forth. And we're going to see here is that Schopenhauer seems to suggest these, and Nietzsche is against this, right? For Nietzsche, the notion of self-sacrifice is something that's actually anti-moralistic. And we'll talk about that here as we get going. And once we begin to articulate what will become known as the master versus the slave morality. Now, these instincts for Nietzsche become value in themselves. These instincts for Schopenhauer become a value in itself. And here is where Nietzsche suggests that what Schopenhauer is doing in his philosophy by saying that self-sacrifice is value in itself, and that we should assume an unegoistic posture, is that Nietzsche is saying no, right? He thinks that Schopenhauer is saying no to life, and he's saying no to the self. And so Nietzsche's discussion of the origin of morality comes as a critique of Schopenhauer. And for Nietzsche, this is the will turning against itself. So Schopenhauer's ethics ultimately is the will sort of kind of eating its own tail. And so he rejects this. In fact, he suggests that what we have here is a sort of nihilism. And we're going to see nihilism being discussed throughout Nietzsche's work. Now, there's sort of two different forms of nihilism. At this juncture, the discussion of nihilism comes in the language of what Nietzsche calls European Buddhism. Now, I don't think we should take that suggested as too strong a discussion regarding what pardon me. I don't think we should take Nietzsche's suggestion that European Buddhism is a form of nihilism is necessarily a proper picture or understanding of what Buddhist philosophy is. Though Buddhism does argue that at the end of the day, all of the things that you think you're experiencing are produced by the ego, and that these productions ultimately are false, or they have no substance. And so there is a sort of nihilism, of valuelessness, that seems to flow out of Buddhism, at least if you have, I think, a very simplistic understanding of Buddhism. But he calls this sort of European Buddhism, this sense in which you destroy the will, right? And this is a total erasure of value for Nietzsche. So, and we'll see, though, that there's another way in which we can look at nihilism, a more positive sense, I think. Now, in section 6 here, we see, quote, we read, quote, we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called into question, and for that there is needed a knowledge of the conditions and the circumstances in which they grew, under which they have evolved and changed, a knowledge of a kind that has never yet existed or even been desired. And here Nietzsche's saying that what we need in order to really understand this problem of nihilistic European Buddhism, in order to understand the critique of Schopenhauer, in order to understand ourselves, what we need to do is we need to develop a critique of moral values that actually looks to the specificity of the history in which they arose the way they did. In other words, we need a history of morality. He says, quote, the project is to traverse with quite novel questions, and as though with new eyes, the enormous, distant, and so well hidden land of morality that have actually existed, actually been lived, and does this mean virtually to discover this land for the first time? So you can see here, he's really focusing in here on the notion that we have to look, ultimately, to develop this critique of morality. We have to begin by looking at the actually existing forms and the actual ways in which people have lived morally, if we're going to understand ultimately what morality is all about and where it's come from. So that means that we have to look here to the actuality of our existing moral life. And this means that the critique of the sort of moral critique and moral philosophy we see in Nietzsche is not a theory about the essence of the ideal moral life. It's not a Platonic view here. It's not an Aristotelian view. It's not a Kantian view. Nietzsche's doing his own thing by focusing on the actuality of our existing moral life. That means that we have to recognize there's an actual history of morality. Morality doesn't simply just come into the world already ready to go, right? Born clear, like born automatically is clear in our ideas. And it's not something objective, it's something that actually has its own history, and that's what we need to take a look at. So, for instance, a critique of the actual history of morality can bring about what Nietzsche says is a sort of cheerfulness. And this is what his book, The Gay Science, is about. That's why he calls it The Gay Science. In other words, Nietzsche thinks that once we begin to recognize the actual history of morality, what we do is we can untether ourselves from the sort of guilt and untether ourselves from the sense of objectivity that we think our moral views have when they don't. And this leads to sort of cheerfulness because it leads to, if you will, a certain sort of liberation, where we recognize that our moral values are constructed rather than discovered. And this is a different way of looking at nihilism. So, if you will, if nihilism is the idea that there are no ideal values to things, we could say that one negative approach is this sort of negative European Buddhism, which is simply to reject yourself and give up on all these things. The other positive sense is to recognize the cheerfulness, the liberality, the freedom that comes along with recognizing that the history of morality is being written by us, by how we actually live our lives. So you have sort of two different types of nihilism, if you will. Now, what can you expect from this book? Well, Nietzsche suggests you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He says, quote, I do not allow that anyone knows that the book, who has not at the same time been profoundly wounded and at the same time profoundly delighted by every word in it. And I think that what he's saying there is that the same thing that applies to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that if you really read it and understand it, you'll both, on the one hand, be profoundly upset and also profoundly liberated. He thinks that same experience is waiting for you as you read this book. Now, this book, The Genealogy of Morality, is structured like The Gay Science and his other works in the form of aphorisms. Now, what's an aphorism? An aphorism is it's a pithy statement that contains a truth of general import. So for Nietzsche, an aphorism properly stamped and molded has not been deciphered when it has simply been read. Rather, one has then to begin its exegesis. Now, exegesis here refers to the critical explanation we can give to things. And what Nietzsche's saying here is he writes in aphorisms. Think of these aphorisms as like little riddles, puzzles that you have to ponder over eventually in order to gain insight from. So that means that unlike, pardon me, unlike, for instance, Kant's philosophy, where you can just read it theoretically and understand what his conjectures and his arguments are, the same thing applies with Aristotle. Here, you have to do a little bit more work. You have to begin to mull over and chew these little aphorisms and begin to develop your own critical explanation. So that means that Nietzsche's not giving it all to you already clear. He wants you to do the work to understand it. Why is that the case? Remember, I said at the beginning that Nietzsche is a philosopher of existence. So what we can say here is that Nietzsche wants the reader to engage in a different form of existence in terms of the the task of philosophical contemplation. In other words, we don't just read off the conclusions and premises and figure out whether or not Nietzsche's theory makes sense. Nietzsche wants you to mull this stuff over in terms of your own existence. And actually, I think that he wants you to, he writes in aphorisms because he wants you to essentially modify your own existence to understand his argument. Okay, so that is the preface to the Genealogy of Morality. Okay, and that's just Nietzsche sort of giving us the down low here in terms of what he's going to be talking about, and ultimately give you a sense of where he's going to be going. Now, what we want to do is let's take the first essay of the Genealogy of Morality, which the title of this essay is Good and Evil, Good and Bad. Now, this distinction is going to become ever present throughout the entire text, but particularly in this first video and in this first essay. He makes this distinction between the moral values of good and evil as being different from the moral values of being good and bad. And we're going to explain those here in a moment. And what you could say too is that good and evil refers to ultimately what he's going to call slave morality, and good and bad refers to ultimately what he's going to refer to as master morality. Now, in terms of the beginning of this first essay, he begins with the critique of what he calls the English psychologist. So here, think about someone like David Hume, or think about someone like Adam Smith, right, the famous economist, and think of the way in which they approached human psychology, right? Their view was that ultimately we look to how people, the sorts of passions that people have, and we begin to recognize the ways in which people organize their reasons and their beliefs to fit those passions. Now, what he doesn't actually name the English psychologist he's talking about, at least not directly here in the text, but I'm thinking immediately, for instance, of someone like Ricardo, Adam Smith, or someone like David Hume, right? Now, what he says, though, is that these English psychologists are interesting, not their arguments, but them. Now, what does that mean, right? That is, he's interested in the way in which the English psychologists have a sort of fearless approach to not try to make human beings look all rational and put together the way Kant's view of human nature seems to be, but rather to look at human beings, warts and all, and recognize that human beings are motivated in a whole bunch of different ways, and it's not always clear what their reasons are, or at least it's not always clear to humans what their reasons are for acting, right? What do the English psychologists do? Well, Nietzsche says, quote, dragging the shame of our inner world into the foreground and seeking the truly effective and directing agent, that which has been decisive in its evolution, and just that place where the intellectual pride of man would desire to find it, would like to desire to find it. So in other words here, is that what the English psychologists do is they look at all of the problems we have and they recognize some of the ugly, harsh truths, right? Later on he says, they're fundamentally brave, these English psychologists. They're proud, they're magnanimous animals who know how to keep their hearts as well as their sufferings in bounds and have trained themselves to sacrifice all desirability to truth, every truth, even plain, harsh, ugly, repellent, unchristian, immoral truth. For such truths do exist. So for Nietzsche, he recognizes that what the English psychologists are doing, not so much in terms of the epistemological theories they have or the theories of the mind they hold, but in terms of their methodology of being willing to follow the truth wherever it may lead, even if it leads in a direction we don't like. And so this is a sort of courage, I think, that Nietzsche is recognizing, and he's advocating that we ourselves also share in this courage. Because here's the thing, as you are starting to read Nietzsche, as you're watching this video, you're going to see that some of the things Nietzsche argues are very shocking, and they are going to become very difficult for you to authentically hear and not just react against. And Nietzsche is arguing that we too need to have the sort of courage to follow truth wherever it may lead. Now, whereas the English psychologists are unhistorical, right? The English psychologists they're not looking to the history of our moral values. They're doing a theoretical analysis, right? What Nietzsche wants to offer is a historical analysis of morality. So this class is about ethical theories, and you can see here is that what Nietzsche offers us is a very different type of ethical theory. Now, what is the origin of the good? Now, for Nietzsche, the English bungled the question, so he doesn't think we can just look to these English psychologists, because for them, the problem always becomes one about utility and usefulness. Think here about utilitarianism. Think here about John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, right, who also Nietzsche has in his sights, right? For them, the problem of what's good is about what's useful to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, or what's useful for social convention or whatnot, or what's even useful for my own psychology, right? But guess what? This is problematic because what this seems to do is it from the very beginning, it a priori reduces the problem of the good to a question of usefulness and utility. But guess what? The good derives from the usefulness of an egoism. It doesn't derive from a usefulness in and of itself in an abstract sense. So in other words, the good for Nietzsche derives from what's useful for the will. Think here about the notion of the will to power. We find this quote in this first section, these first sections, where Nietzsche says, quote, "The judgment good did not originate with those to whom goodness was shown. Rather, it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, the powerful, the high-stationed, and the high-minded, who felt and established themselves and their actions as good." So Nietzsche's view here is that good is something that is created. It's not just discovered. It's something that's constructed. In particular, the good for Nietzsche is constructed by those who have power, those who can enable the will to power. Now, this is interesting. What we do is we suddenly recognize this idea of the pathos of distance. And the pathos of distance is the pathos of nobility, right? Nietzsche says they first seized the right to create values and to coin names for values. What had they to do with utility, right? So Nietzsche's notion here is that the powerful people in the past, the people who had the most amount of will to power, and who could empower their own will, who could rule over others, these are the noble lords. These are the people who are the high classes, right? Who had the political power. These people created values and they decided what was good. Did it matter what was useful? It's not utility itself, certainly not to a utility principle that activates this. This is the pathos of the nobility, the notion that the people who have a will to power, the noble lords for Nietzsche, they ultimately have a distance. They have a sort of distance between those to whom they rule, right? And it's given by the sort of pathology, really, right? He says, quote, "The protracted and domineering fundamental total feeling on that part of a higher ruling order in relation to a lower ruling order to a below." So for him, the notion that good just comes from what's useful isn't make any sense. The history of morality seems to demonstrate that what's good derives from those who are above others, those who have power over others. And here we get that Nietzsche mentions the herd instinct. The herd instinct is Nietzsche's notion or his idea that human beings naturally tend to herd towards each other. Nietzsche frequently calls human beings a herd animal with a herd instinct. That is, we naturally tend to congregate and do what others around us do. Notice this. Notice next time you're in an elevator, when you stand in one, if notice that everyone stands in the same direction. Everyone acts the way everyone else acts. So next time you're in an elevator, just when everyone's facing the doors, just turn around and face the wall and see how people react. You'll see people become very uncomfortable, and or people begin to do what you start to do. People will start looking backwards too, in order to herd themselves. And so we have the notion here is that it looks like that the origin of the good is created by a noble class that ultimately rules over the herd. Um, in the herd is what's bad, not good. In section 3 here, Nietzsche then begins to discuss what the utility explanation of morality fails to recognize. And what it fails to recognize is that the origin of value is not forgotten, but it's continually reinforced. He says, quote, instead of fading from consciousness, instead of becoming easily forgotten, it must have been impressed on the consciousness more and more clearly. So the useful is not a good, the useful is not something that's valuable in itself, and the useful is not that which is valuable in the highest degree. Because what's good and what's valuable in itself and what's valuable in the highest degree is the will to power of what the noble believes is good. And so for him, if you go back historically, the origin of morality is a story about how we control others and how ultimately we ourselves are controlled. Now, where do we begin? How can we prove this point? For Nietzsche, who's a philologist, and remember, philology is the study of word history, and etymology is the history of a particular word. What we can say is that we can look to the etymological significance of the designations for good. And what Nietzsche does is he does this, and he begins to recognize that the word good has its historical roots in something that's quite different. It has its roots not in an ideal concept like Plato or Aristotle might say, or Kant, but it looks like the good is derived from the political class. It's derived from the noble and the aristocratic class, whereas the word bad seems to derive from the word for the common and the plebeian classes. Now, he gives the example in German of schlecht, which means bad. And this word has its origin in the word schlechtweg, which means plain, or schlechterdings, which means something like simple. And so he says, for instance, and when you look to the good, the gut, right, in German, it ultimately has its own source in the words which are aligned with the aristocratic class. So what we have here is the development of what we might call the moral genealogy. And this is, I think, the fundamental insight, the fundamental idea of this entire work, is that ultimately, in order to gain a knowledge of ourselves, remember Nietzsche says that we are unknown to ourselves. In order to gain knowledge of ourselves, we have to develop a moral genealogy. And just in the same way that you can have a genealogy of a family tree, you can look to see who your ancestors were, we can also look to see what our moral ancestry entails. And we have a sort of democratic prejudice here that we need to overcome, right? It's not that what's good, that the notion of our moral values is simply a result of all of us coming together and agreeing to these things. Quite the reverse. Nietzsche thinks that what a moral genealogy will show is that the notions of good and bad have ultimately been pounded into our heads generation after generation. Right. Now, the etymology, as I mentioned earlier, of the good reveals that although the nobles, designating themselves by their superior power, it is the typical character trait that's important. So, for instance, the Greeks had this word of truth, had this concept of the truthful as being absolutely essential. Well, the root word of the notion of truthful in Greek there is esthlos, and that signifies one who possesses reality, and who is actual, who is true. Notice that the truthful actually originates from the notion of the actuality of something. Now, what we see here is that we've gone from a character trait of someone being truthful into a catchphrase that someone should be truthful. And Nietzsche thinks this is important, and that it's within these small deviations that all of the history of morality lies. And what we need here is an ordering of the genealogy from the actuality towards ideality. So the origin of morality begins with our actual moral practices, the actual character traits of the noble class, but then those character traits, through linguistically, ultimately develop into a sort of ideal transcendental system of values. So, for example, the Latin term bonus, which means good, gets derived from the word for warrior, right? So it's from the word for warrior that we actually get the term good, at least in its Latin philological way, right? Now, in section 6, Nietzsche introduces what we might call as a genealogical rule. He says, quote, or he writes, quote, "A concept denoting political superiority always resolves itself into a concept denoting superiority of the soul." So what we see here is a clear, what we might say is that our notion of the soul is always mapped onto or comes from a political concept, right? A socially derived concept that has to do with power. He gives the example, think of the priestly caste, right? This is where we get the terms for things. The priestly caste gets their terms, this is where we get terms like pure and impure from. And this will be important, particularly with regard to his discussion of Judaism and its role in the history of Western morality. Nietzsche adds, there is from the first something unhealthy in such priestly aristocracies and the habits ruling in them, which turn away from action and alternate between brooding and emotional explosions, habits which seem to have as their almost invariable consequence that intestinal morbidity and neurasthenia which has afflicted priests at all times. So there's a way in which ultimately Nietzsche is very critical of the way in which what were once character traits that politically developed into these ideal concepts, which then eventually develop into these religious concepts for our sense of what's good and bad and good and evil. And ultimately what you can say is that the good and bad distinction is one which is rooted in the political, whereas the good and the evil is rooted in the priestly for Nietzsche. He says, quote, "For with the priest everything becomes more dangerous. Not only cures and remedies, but also arrogance, revenge, acuteness, profligacy, lust to rule, virtue, disease. The priestly existence is something that's essentially dangerous for Nietzsche. But the priestly existence is also the soil that enabled the growth of morality for the type of morality we actually hold. Because for us today, when we think of what's good and bad, we tend to think of these as spiritual concepts. And so Nietzsche thinks this is very dangerous, actually, and particularly dangerous to the noble lord, right? So there's going to be a sort of contrast here between the knightly aristocrat who ultimately has the character traits where we get our concepts of good and bad from, but also the priest, for where we get this richer sense of good versus evil. We get a quote here. He says, quote, "A powerful physicality, a flourishing, abundant, overflowing health, together with that which serves to preserve it, war, adventure, hunting, dancing, war games, and in general, all that involves vigorous, free, joyful activity." So Nietzsche's view here is that the aristocrat, the knightly aristocrat, the noble lord here, has a sort of natural sense of what's good, and that natural sense is a sort of joyful activity of enabling the will to power. It's sort of abundant, overflowing health and all the things that are necessary for that. Now, by contrast, Nietzsche sees the priests as haters, right? And as the most evil of enemies, right? And here, Nietzsche offers a pretty severe critique on what he thinks of here as Jewishness, or the way in which Judaism played a role in the historical development of our moral concepts. And here I have to be honest, there's a number of things that Nietzsche says which I think are quite challenging and appear to be quite anti-Semitic. So I want to be clear that even though in this video I'm covering Nietzsche's arguments, I'm not in any way endorsing what I personally perceive to be a strain of strong anti-Semitism within Nietzsche's work. And I think so. So we'll talk about that later as we go through this, because there is a sort of dark history to Nietzschean studies, particularly when we look historically at the way the Nazis really liked Nietzsche's philosophy, which I find quite troubling and disturbing to say the least. So I'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the next series of videos. Now let's keep going back here to this distinction between the knightly aristocrat versus the priest. Now, for the priest, at least in terms for Nietzsche's view, the priest inverts values, right? So what's normally good for the aristocrat, is something that is treated as bad by the priest. So what we see here is an equation of value gets inverted. So when we look at the history of morality, Nietzsche thinks that we have a sort of egoism that's really the basis of our moral values, but that with the priestly caste, we see a complete inversion of the situation where good becomes evil and bad becomes good. He says, quote, "With the Jews there begins the slave revolt in morality, that revolt which has a history of 2,000 years behind it, which we no longer see because, well, it has been victorious," right? And here, think about that early little clip I showed you, where the character was talking about the nobles and how all things have been diminished and all these sorts of things. This is, I think, what Nietzsche is talking about. Or I think that's what that section of the video is also about. Now, here, if we want to talk about Nietzsche and anti-Semitism, which I think there's a profoundly important discussion that needs to be had here. I think there's a critique of Nietzsche's work, but I think it would be foolish to simply say if you see Nietzsche's work as anti-Semitic, I think it would be foolish to simply disregard its philosophical, um, the philosophical thesis here. And so to take a look at here as sort of defense of Nietzsche against anti-Semitism, see Walter Kaufmann's work. In particular, see his book on Nietzsche. Walter Kaufmann is sort of one of the most important Nietzschean scholars, who tends to be one of the most well-read translators of Nietzsche. Take a look at his work, in which he has a long and a sustained discussion regarding anti-Semitism, regarding the Nazis, and so on and so forth in Nietzsche. What I'm going to try to do in this video is not so much get into the details of that, but really focus on how Nietzsche articulates the argument. So let's get back here to the slave revolt and morality. And here you got to think of basically the Romans versus the Jews, right? Historically, the Romans were an empirical people that basically subjugated different smaller groups. And you have here that the Jews, or Judaism, was ultimately a priestly group of people, particularly people who were devoted to their God and to maintaining their religious order, right? Nietzsche here, what he thinks happens is that what develops out of Judaism in the Roman moment. So when think of during the Bible in the New Testament, for instance, you have the Romans are ruling over the Jews, over the Jewish people in Israel. And this is when Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, emerges. And ultimately, what Nietzsche thinks here is that the Roman order essentially represented the natural way of morality, the natural origin of morality, which comes from the character traits of the powerful and the strong, right? And he thinks what happens over time is that that ultimately the slaves, there's a slave revolt of morality where what was considered by the master to be good is treated as evil in the religious order, and what was considered bad by the master is treated as what's good for the natural order, right? He says a tree of vengefulness and hatred leads to a, quote, new form of love. The morality of love derives from the hatred of the aristocratic class. He says, quote, this Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate gospel of love, this Redeemer who brought blessedness and victory to the poor, the sick, and the sinners, was he not this seduction in its most uncanny and irresistible form? And ultimately what Nietzsche thinks here is that Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, preaches, for instance, that the poor will inherit the earth. Well, that's the opposite value that the aristocratic noble lords would have, right? Their view is that they inherit the earth, not the poor, right? Jesus preaches that you should love all people, right? Love the stranger as you would love yourself. That's not what the Roman aristocratic noble lord does, right? What they do is they love themselves and they love other people only insofar as other people work according to or in congruity with their own will to power. So you can see here is that Christianity in particular is what Nietzsche identifies as the slave revolt in morality that ultimately develops into our own moral system. Okay, number 9 is that this means is that the accepted values that we hold today in the Western moral tradition, these are the result of a Judeo-Christianization in which the noble values that originated our concepts of good and bad had been inverted. Quote, the progress of this poison through the entire body of mankind seems irresistible. Its pace and tempo may from now on ever grow slower, subtler, less audible, more cautious, but there's still plenty of time, right? Pardon a couple spelling errors there, right? So Nietzsche's view here is that this inversion, this slave revolt of morality is was victorious. So victorious that today we're only left with the singular set of moral concepts within the Western world. And these moral concepts are actually an inversion of the natural psychology of things. So, in other words, the sort of moral values that we hold as being quite natural, values like you should give unto others as you give unto yourself, he thinks these are not at all natural, and that these are the result of a history that is developed in a very different way that runs quite counterintuitive to the sort of story we tend to tell ourselves about immorality. He says today it alienates rather than seduces, right? So today the story of the Judeo-Christianization of values ultimately tends to alienate rather than seduce us, but it's still an ongoing situation, right? And here Nietzsche has like an extended critique of the church and the way in which, in particular, he's talking about the Christian church, the way in which the Christian church has promulgated this inversion of values and continues to do so today, or at least within his own day. Now, where does the slave revolt in morality begin? The answer is it begins with resentment, or he actually used a French term here, ressentiment. So I'll say that, and that's the slave revolt, not the salve revolt, right? But the slave revolt in morality begins with ressentiment, with resentment. In other words, he thinks that the Jewish slaves in the Roman world resented and hated the Roman masters. And accordingly, in an attempt to overcome them, which they couldn't overcome them physically or politically, but they overcame them morally by changing the definition of the very moral values that we're supposed to hold. That is, by redefining what's good and what's evil. Quote, the slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values, the ressentiment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge. Notice here that he's a philosopher of existence. So he thinks that what we've done in morality is we've swapped out the real with the imaginary, right? So he goes on, the slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, to what is different, to what is not itself. And this no is its creative deed. This inversion of the value positing I, this needs to direct one's view outward instead of back to oneself. This is the essence of ressentiment, right? So the reverse of ressentiment is the noble valuation. So you have to sort of begin to understand the way in which the noble would value something is the opposite of the way in which the person who has resentment would value it. And this is the source, this is the creative force which enables ultimately the slave revolt. It's sort of interesting here, what you could say is that the slave revolt in morality in a certain way goes beyond the moral values because there's a sort of creative dimension that is not captured by the aristocratic class. And so this is sort of interesting here, right? Now, here I titled The Nobler Being. Let me just read you this quote. Nietzsche says, to be incapable of taking one's enemies, one's accidents, even one's misdeeds seriously for very long, that is the sign of the strong. The full natures in whom there is an excess of the power to form, to mold, to recuperate, and to forget. Such a man shakes off with a single shrug many vermin that eat deep into others. Here alone, genuine love of enemies is possible, right? So here we have this notion that Nietzsche is offering a stark comparison here, that the person who's a nobler being, the person, the master, if you will, is the person who decides for themselves. They mold, they recuperate, they forget things as they need to be. They shake off with a single shrug other moral things that would eat deeply into our hearts. Think of here of the way in which guilt can eat at you, right? Nietzsche's view here is that the person who has the will to power doesn't have guilt, right? They only act egoistically for themselves and sculpt and construct a concept of what's good and bad. Whereas the person who's eaten away by guilt is the person who treats good as something which is already outside of themselves. And you can see here he's clearly referencing Jesus Christ in the Golden Rule here to love your enemies as yourself, right? Or love your enemies. Now, the nobleman, quote, conceives the basic concept good in advance and spontaneously out of himself, and only then creates for himself the idea of the bad. So that means that moral values are ultimately a consequence of what we will into the world. They are not the result of discovering the objective truth of things. So you can see Nietzsche is completely 100% actively opposed to the moral critique of Immanuel Kant, for instance. So here we have the distinction between good versus bad and good versus evil. Good and evil is a distinction that's operated by slave morality, birthed out of resentment, and good and bad is moral concepts which are the result of the master morality's will to power. So that's how we can begin to distinguish the differences between these things, which is, of course, the primary subject of this first essay in the Genealogy of Morality. Now, who are these nobles, though? Nietzsche says they're the Roman, they're Arabian, they're Germanic, they're Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings, etc. Right? So for him, the nobles are any of those peoples in history who have ultimately decided what is good and decided what is bad according to what was to their own advantage as noble lords. That is, in other words, whoever has the will to power. Who are not the nobles are, for him, he would say, of course, the Jewish people, but he would say any people who are essentially subjugated over time and who are forced to adopt the values of whoever subjugates them. Now, it's interesting here, we suddenly get a short discussion on culture and what the meaning of culture is. Nietzsche says the meaning of culture is the reduction of the beast of prey, man, to a tame and a civilized animal, a domestic animal. Then one would undoubtedly have to regard all those instincts of reaction and resentment through whose aid the noble races and their ideals were finally confounded and overthrown as the actual instruments of culture. So you have a sort of anti-cultural sense of culture in Nietzsche, which is namely that culture is about the taming out of individuality. It's about the cultivation of the herd. And this means that for Nietzsche, culture is a bad word in terms of our moral values. It's not a good word because culture is the means by which you boil out of the equation the will to power. In other words, you boil out of the equation the noble aesthetic, right, which is what Nietzsche seems to want to protect and emphasize here. Now, we have this sense that there's a search for the Übermensch, or the Overman. We mentioned at the very onset of the video here that the Übermensch, or the Overman, refers to those people who ultimately, now in our own day, will be able to then cast off the values that have been given to them by their culture and instead articulate their own values. Nietzsche writes, quote, "But grant me from time to time, if there are divine goddesses in the realm beyond good and evil, grant me the sight, but one glance of something perfect, wholly achieved, happy, mighty, triumphant, something still capable of arousing fear, of a man who justifies man, of a complimentary and redeeming lucky hit on the part of man for the sake of which one may still believe in man." So in other words, what Nietzsche is saying here in section 12 is that what he ultimately wants to see is a return of the noble lord, right? He wants a return to what is noble and good, not simply the constant devaluing of the noble. So he wants the Übermensch, and this is sort of, we'll talk about the Übermensch later, but this is the first sort of sense of the Übermensch we get from Nietzsche in the genealogy, right? Now, in section 13, we get the idea that the inversion of moral values leads to an inversion in the perception of values. So that means that when we invert our moral values, now we've changed the way in which we perceive our moral values. He says, quote, "The sublime self-deception that interprets weakness as freedom and there being thou and thus as a merit," right? So what we see here is that for Nietzsche, what the good and evil moral system enables historically is it enables a self-deception where we perceive weakness as being strength, as being freedom, and we perceive strength as being evil, as being someone who's anti-God, for instance. Notice that, for instance, in Christianity, what the Christian is supposed to do, at least in classic traditional Christianity, whether you're looking at Catholicism or in Protestantism, what the Christian's supposed to do is they're supposed to give up their will to the will to God, right? Think about the Lord's Prayer, right? let your will be done, not mine, right? Now, this is for Nietzsche a sort of self-deception in which we begin to invert those historic moral values we once held. And that means, but when we change the perception, though, it means that when we see other people living in the world, we perceive them in such a way, and we think that those are naturally. So when we perceive someone who's acting for their own will and power, in the contemporary world, we see that as a bad thing. That person's trying to get something for themselves, and they're not interested in the greater good, right? We judge those people negatively. But the key here is that we perceive them in such a way, but the perception itself is an inverted, misguided fact of our, or I guess, our moral origin. So number 14 here, now I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Nietzsche does offer an example of this type of self-deception in the form of his own sort of inner monologue. I'll let you take a look at that. I'm going to sort of run through some of these sections a little bit quickly. In section 15, we see that Nietzsche grounds his analysis in the words of the Christian fathers, notably Thomas Aquinas. So Nietzsche spares no expense. Thomas Aquinas, who's considered the doctor of the Catholic Church, preeminent Christian philosopher of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas is for Nietzsche um, right at the very center of the reinforcement of this inversion. And this ultimately is something that's actually for Nietzsche quite evil and hateful, right? He thinks that Thomas Aquinas is propounding these inverted moral values, and this is telling a false story ultimately about the history and the truth of morality. Now notice here what we said earlier, we said where Nietzsche talked about the idea that we need to follow the truth even if it takes us into places we don't like. And here's an example of one of these, right? Now, in section 16, Nietzsche begins his conclusion of this first essay. He says, "Let us conclude. The two opposing values, good and bad and good and evil, have been engaged in a fearful struggle on earth for thousands of years. And though the latter value has certainly been on top for a long time, there are still places where this struggle is as yet undecided." So, for instance, what Nietzsche's suggestion here is that even though it looks like the inverted moral values we hold today are on top, and it looks like that we're going to be stuck with these moral values, these Christian moral values, ultimately he says the struggle still continues. And it will still continue. And he thinks that the symbol, if you're going to try to tie a symbol to it, it's the symbol of the distinction between Rome versus Judea, right? Ultimately, the symbol between the masters and the slaves, between the rulers and the ruled, right? And this symbol for him is ultimately a symbol for this what's still happening today, even though for the most part it looks like our Western moral values have been completely, mainly all of our Western moral values are just these inverted slave moral values. Now Nietzsche will evaluate European history along these lines, right? So for instance, the Reformation is a type of slave morality. The French Revolution is another type of slave morality. Now the idea that the rights of the majority, right? Think of the American Revolution. It's another type of slave morality. But a notable example of master morality comes when you look at the history of Napoleon, right? Where what Napoleon seems to represent is a synthesis of the inhuman and the superhuman, right? And so for Nietzsche, he might also say that Napoleon is Übermensch, right? Napoleon was a person who didn't appropriate the values of his day. Rather, he created the values that others appropriated in his day. And it's interesting here, although I certainly don't think this, there is a way in which Donald Trump, we're sitting here in the first year of Donald Trump's presidency, and it looks like Donald Trump has issued in a sort of new sense of values. And it looks like for Donald Trump, the values which are good are the ones which are precisely aligned to his own egoism. Now, this makes me very nervous because the last thing I want to do is give some sort of defense of Donald Trump here, because I abhor his sort of political worldview. But you can see here, and I know Nietzsche, of course, I think would have great pains to say that Donald Trump is Ubermensch, but it does look like Donald Trump is not adopting the regular moral system that the rest of us seem to operate by. And this seems to be indicative of Ubermensch-like activity, right? So what we see here is a distinction between between good and bad and good and evil. And what we can say is that ultimately what Nietzsche's interested in is beyond good and evil, not beyond good and bad, because good and evil is slave morality, and we need to go beyond that for Nietzsche. We need to escape the gravity well of this historical moral system that is rooted in, for Nietzsche, in a creative, resentful hatred. And we need to move forward into into a moral system which recognizes this, recognizes the will to power, and adopts the good and the bad dialectic. So what we see here is it's beyond good and evil, not beyond good and bad. Remember, that's the name of that first book Nietzsche wrote. So you can tell even from the very beginning of Nietzsche's work, he's thinking about these things. So that concludes our discussion for Nietzsche's preface and the first essay for the Genealogy of Morality. Watch out. We'll be coming up with our next video on the second essay to the Genealogy of Morality soon. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you guys online next time.